Okay, I think we can begin. So welcome everybody. My name is Beth Fisher-Yoshida, and I am a professor of practice and program director of the Negotiation and Conflict Resolution Program here at the School of Professional Studies at Columbia University in the city of New York. It's rather a long title. And I'm really excited to have our guest today because decision-making is such a core part of what we do every minute, every day, even if we're not realizing that we're constantly making decisions. So some decisions are very light and don't affect us too much, and some decisions can be fateful for how we spend the rest of our lives. So I'm going to introduce very briefly our two presenters for today, and then they will do a much more thorough job at introducing themselves as they each present their material. The format will be that Barry Sommer, who is presenting on You Can Change Your Own Life, Stories for Decision Making. He'll present on that, and he'll show some slides, and then I'll introduce our second speaker, which is Talya Miron-Shatz. Your Life Depends on It is her book, and then she will present on her book, and then we'll have a conversation amongst the panel, and then we also welcome you to send in any comments or questions you may have to the Q&A function. You'll notice it at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, I'd like to bring Barry Sommer on, and he can say a little bit more about himself, his background, how he got to write this book, and something more about the book. So Barry?
Thank you so much, Beth. I'm hoping you can see my screen. I'm going to show you a few slides. What a pleasure to be here today and to talk about decision-making, such a relevant topic for most of us. You Can Choose Your Own Life is about stories for decision-making by my co-author, Barbara Kerr, and myself. I have the good fortune of being an educational psychologist who's invested in teaching as a primary mode of helping people and psychotherapy. So this book kind of brought together both of those interests, and it was inspired by the writings of Viktor Frankl. So why did we write this book? Well, we wrote this book for a number of reasons. One, that children, and this book has been developed for 10 to 15-year-olds. By age 3, children have learned or are beginning to learn that their behavior affects the actions and feelings of others. And we want to be developing responsible decision-making in young children so that their internal voice can serve as the guide, not our external voice. So they needed a cognitive strategy that would enhance their abilities to make good decisions. We know that when we are using a structure or a format to make decisions, we make better decisions. It's obvious to me and to many of you that we have many, many, many decisions to make. Think about how many choices you've made already today. Did I wake up on the first firing of my alarm? Did I take a shower? Did I wash my hair? What did I wash my hair with? What did I dress? We've made hundreds of decisions by the time we're sitting here, and you're deciding whether you're paying attention right now. And we're vulnerable, therefore, to decision-making fatigue. So many choices. How do we make the very best choices? And middle school children are making decisions that will impact potentially the rest of their lives. So we've provided for them an engaging way to make decisions, learn a model that they can rehearse and practice. What inspired us to do this? Many years ago, as an educational psychologist, I was asked to develop a family life curriculum for a large public school district. That's code for sex education, by the way. And the district was experiencing the highest rate of teenage pregnancy in the state of California. And they had a huge problem with sexually transmitted diseases. So the typical traditional approach has PE teachers teaching anatomy and physiology, and there didn't seem to be any good evidence that that was helping those problems. We needed to teach human sexuality around decision-making, not around anatomy and physiology. So they brought us in, my partner, Barbara Kerr, a Ph.D. English with a strong background in emotional intelligence. to develop a program. And when we looked at what would be the best fit, we recognized that we needed to model and teach decision-making. And so we developed a structure very consistent with many decision-making models that asks young middle school kids to decide what the problem was, to name that problem, to brainstorm the information they needed, to option 3 choices, although they could option many others, to weigh the positive and negative consequences of each of those options, to recognize the importance of values in making their decision, and finally to make a choice, see if it brought the desired outcome, stick with it or revise, come back to the plan. And when we did this, we practiced with decisions that were relevant to them. And then we asked them to practice with the decision that they chose. And interestingly enough, in the late 90s, the number one decision among 10 to 15-year-olds in our population of thousands of learners was, who should I live with, my mother or my father? This is the weight of the kind of decisions that young people are making. So we've organized the book as a choose your own adventure book. You start in a situation like this one. You're sitting in math class and the teacher is explaining a complicated math concept, but you're doodling. He walks up behind you and he says, would you like to explain the concept of factoring to the class? Or are we disturbing your artwork? He says sarcastically, and then you get to make a choice. And you could choose to be apologetic. You say you're sorry, or you could get angry, or you could do nothing. And based on those decisions, you move to other pages in the book or the electronic version, and you continue to play out your choices until it leads to both a short-term and a long-term consequence. We did this with relevant chapters like being in charge of yourself at school, the pressure to drink at the school dance, coping with domestic violence at home, responding to a crush and early sexuality, and finally dealing with cyberbullying. And that's, you can choose your own life in a flash, and I'd be glad to refer you to the resources we use to develop it and to answer any questions that you have after we hear from Talya. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, Beth.
Thank you, Barry. That was great looking through that. And the format is so simple and clear to use, maybe not pulling in the answers, but the format itself lends itself to a nice, easy, structured method.
We found it engaging. Thanks.
Great. Good. So now, Talya, we'll have a chance to hear from you. Please say a little bit about your background, how you got into writing the book you're writing, and then take it away. And you're still on mute, okay?
That could be an interesting way to give a talk now, wouldn't it? Right? Yes, so I'm going to share my screen, just figuring it all out, which is funny because I've been doing Zoom for a long time. So yes, bear with me. Thank you. There we are. Okay. So my name is Dr. Talya Miron-Shatz. I have a Ph.D. in psychology. And I wanted to talk to you today about, well, obviously about my book, Your Life Depends on It, what you can do to make better choices about your health. All of you right now in New York. It's in the storefront of Barnes & Noble on Fifth Avenue. So please go take a look. It's very, very, very exciting to me and obviously to the entire universe, or not really. The title of our conversation today is Responsible Decision-Making in Health. And I wanted to ask, whose responsibility is it? So I'll talk about the book and I'll talk about a bit of a stir that was caused following the book. So our agenda for today is the empowered patient, question mark, the healthcare consumer, question mark, because as patients, we're now also consumers. I'm actually speaking to you from Boston from the health conference, courtesy of Zoom. I can be in both places at the same time. And that's a question here that's constantly being raised. Are we patients? Are we consumers? How can we be empowered? How can we help? And by we, I mean researchers, psychologists, physicians, healthcare executives. Do we need to help? And whose responsibility is it? So a little bit about me. As I mentioned, I have a PhD in psychology. That's from Hebrew University. I did my postdoc at Princeton University with Daniel Kahneman, who I'm sure you all know. I taught at Wharton. I taught consumer behavior at Wharton, again, with the consumerism. Right now, I am a full professor at the Ono Academic College in Israel and visiting researcher at the University of Cambridge. I have a lot of academic experience, but I also have a lot of industry experience because it's always been fascinating to me. And in fact, I felt it was my responsibility working in the health space to bring my knowledge into action with various pharmaceutical companies, health advertisers, et cetera, all of which are concerned with prescriber behavior, consumer patient behavior, patient knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. That's my book. We'll get there in 1 minute. It's called Your Life Depends on It: What You Can Do to Make Better Choices About Your Health. So the way it was publicized is my premise is we are all now healthcare consumers, but with air quotes. This does not mean we do a great job or a good job at making medical choices, or that we should do this alone. And this is something that I've been concerned with for a while, and actually promoting the notion that we probably need more help than we realize, and we deserve to get this help, not because we're an underserved population necessarily or have low health literacy, et cetera, but because when we are in a bind, and being a patient puts you in a bind, we need all the help we can get. Not everybody likes this message, but okay. So a few key points from the book. That's like a cheat sheet, but the real thing is much better. So key points. When making decisions, we're prone to biases, right? That's decision-making 101. You've all heard about it. You've all read Daniel Kahneman's book, et cetera. But that happens. And when that happens to us in the health domain, the consequences are dire, much more than regarding what we wore today or whether or not we chose which toothpaste we chose. There are main barriers to making great decision-making in the health domain. It's about trust and relationship, because if you don't have that, you have nothing, and you're even more likely to drop off of your medication when you don't feel your doctor actually cares about you. There's a whole huge component of comprehension where we receive a lot of health information, but do we understand it? And then we're required to make choice. That's not always simple. I want to show, and I do show, that we and our doctors need all the help we can get. So that's my track record on Google Scholar. I'm bringing it here because one of my best-selling papers is called Deliberation Before Determination. What this means is that we have to have a good decision-making process. I don't want to talk about the outcome because I don't know what the outcome will be, especially in the healthcare domain and medicine. That's always hit or miss. You never know. But as healthcare systems and physicians, there should be a commitment to creating a good process by which patients can actually make a decision rather than have it thrown at them. And you can see I brought here an example of what I think is great System 1 thinking. System 1 is very fast. It's based on not a lot of information, not a lot of data, and a lot of emotion. And this one says no vaccine. And actually, I also like the title. It says COVID-19 vaccine, no thanks, but why? What are the reasons? We don't know. But that's System 1 thinking. It's very effective. Does it lead to great health consequences? Not always, but that is effective, and that's how people think. There's an attempt here to do this with the opposite message of don't get vaccinated because we're a funeral parlor and then you're going to give us a lot of business. A little more highbrow than the former message. So I said we're healthcare consumers. That's great, right? We're consumers in many other areas of our lives. But actually in the healthcare space, we realize that doctors are overprescribing. And when I looked into that, I found research showing that 85% of them do that because they are afraid of being sued. So they just practice defensive medicine. 71% of doctors just do that because there's fee for service, and they will prescribe something additional because they're going to make a buck. Not a great place to be when you're the consumer. And 59%, they do that because there's patient requests. So we are the consumers. We ask for something. Do we really need it? Is it really going to benefit us? I'm not sure. That's what I wrote down here. Customer is not always right. So we do need to make informed choices. One of the really beautiful things that Daniel Offrey, sorry, it's Columbia, so I'm bringing an NYU professor to the table, but she wrote about my book. The stakes for medical decision making are so high and the circumstances so fraught that it's no wonder that most people feel overwhelmed. Going back again to the question of, are we empowered patients? Is it great that we're consumers and we're making choices, or do we need help because we feel overwhelmed? So you can ask, do we feel overwhelmed? There's so much information. There's WebMD. We can go there. We watch medical shows on TV, right? And that's information. But the truth is, it's entertainment. It's not really information. It's not really educating you about what it's like in the health domain. And we have very few people who are wonderful health communicators like Dr. Mike in the picture with over 7 million subscribers to his YouTube channel, who conveys very clearly, very effectively, very system one on health issues. But not a lot of that happening, and certainly not a lot of that happening from very formal channels. And that's why we often go places that are informal, like social media, and find whatever wacky or unwacky information is out there. So even in this day and age of information, we're not guaranteed to find valid information. Then there's information that we can't find on social media. It's information like this one, generated courtesy of the center where I work at the University of Cambridge, to show women's extra survivorship given various cancer treatments following mastectomy. You can't find this on Twitter. You have to have a professional figure this out. This is actually publicly available on the NHS website. It's called Predict, and it's free regardless of where you are in the world. And it's very clear to understand. You can see that if you use this hormone therapy, there'll be 4 extra survivors. 80 women will just live happily ever after. 8 women will die because of breast cancer. 4 women will have shifted from risking death to now living thanks to hormone replacement therapy. As I said, I'm all about the process. I'm uninvested in the outcome, but I do want people to have a good process. This is what a good process looks like. And regardless of how smart you are as a consumer, you cannot possibly generate this type of information on your own. So responsible decision-making, right? Who's responsible for giving you this type of information? And then I mentioned there's choice. Choice is great, right? We make consumer choices all the time, but what I show is that choice is difficult. I guess we all know that. And I brought a terrific example from choice by physicians, where if the order form for physicians is pre-filled for ventilated patients ordering mouthwash, which reduces pneumonia significantly, then 90% of physicians will use that. If it's not in the form, only 50% of them will order that. So we need help making good choices, as do our physicians. This isn't a weak person thing. This isn't a low health literacy person issue. This is an overarching issue. Daniel Kahneman was very kind. I actually met him 2 days ago. He writes about the book having compassion. Nice. And useful guidance for the hardest decisions of life. Why compassion? I think compassion, we all need it when we're in the patient role. Our doctors need it as well. They work very hard. They are strapped for time. They're strapped for resources. And we need to understand that. So everything I'm saying comes from truly a compassionate point of view. Here, we're just going to skip this one. And okay, the Next Big Idea Club said the past year has shown that confusion exists prominently in our medical conversations. Switch over to a Wall Street Journal article I wrote, where I said, can patients decide their own care? There was a lot of debate over that. Actually, there was quite heated discussion with people saying, wait a minute. Yeah, I can decide my own care. Don't you tell me that I cannot, or most patients can, etc. A big question. My claim is that for the most part, when we're really in a pinch, it becomes incredibly difficult for us. I don't see this as a condescending point of view, I see this just as a very realistic matter. I got a shout out from ePatient Dave, who's someone very powerful in the patient empowerment movement. So I'm bringing this up because the title of our discussion today is about responsible decision making. You could think, well, you're the patient, make a responsible decision. My claim is to make responsible decisions, we need responsible healthcare systems and responsible physicians to partake. So to sum, your life really depends on your medical decision-making. It is our duty as patients, as doctors, as healthcare executives to help improve decision-making processes. All parties involved would benefit, and all of them actually need guidance. I really, really thank you for this wonderful invitation, this wonderful discussion. And I've put all my contact info here. I would absolutely love to hear from all of you, to connect and to get feedback on the book, which I would love for you to read. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Talya. So what I heard both of you talking about was that there are different kinds of what I would call like ingredients that go into good or healthy decision-making processes. You both are addressing different kinds of health-related situations, be it mental health, be it physical health, whole being kind of health, if we don't separate the dichotomy of mind and body there, because it is all connected. So a couple of things I'd like to throw out and then ask you to comment on. So one is that, and I think you both in some ways mentioned bias. We have biases that are sometimes implicit in ourselves that we're not aware of. We have peer pressure and other kinds of pressure from all around us in our social worlds about what we should do or shouldn't do, and then we have to make those decisions. So if you can each speak on that and a couple of tips about how does any one person decide who or what should influence how they make those decisions? What criteria should they consider in making good or healthy decisions? So I'll just throw it to Barry first and then Talya, if that's okay.
Great question, Beth. I think the ecology of making decisions is really quite complex. I think it's context matters, time and place matter. You named so many of the influences that help shape our decisions. I think both Talya and I are suggesting that when we slow the process down and we bring it to a more cognitive foundation, we can think through it much more carefully. And when we do that, for instance, by using a model like the one we suggest, then we make more informed decisions that are less likely to be influenced by those factors you just named, including bias. I think we want to gather information, and that's a part of decision-making that's often left out. When we take a look at bad decisions that people have made, they're often making them when they're hungry and tired. We know that the brain needs protein to make good decisions. When we study it carefully, we know that people who are up for parole, for instance, and scheduled afternoon are much less likely to get paroled because the panel that's making the decisions about whether to parole people or not are exhausted by noon. And rather than erring on the side of making a bad decision, they'll err on the side of making no decision. So you'll want to get early on that agenda, and you want to be thinking through decisions in a thoughtful, organized, systematic way that likely controls at some level some of those influences that help shape our decision.
Talya, thank you, Barry.
Yes, thank you. Well, that's a small question with a very, very, very long answer. I'll answer from a number of angles. The first angle is that of decision making in general. And I started out by talking about system one, decision making. It's very tempting to do that. It is incredibly tempting to just base our decision off of some cues that are emotional, that don't involve a lot of information. And we see that. So there's a lot of work on advertising, and you all know that, because if you've ever seen a direct-to-consumer commercial, you know that they talk about the most horrific side effects in the calmest tones while showing you very beautiful scenery. So the trick here is really to ask yourself, what do I know about this? Not how do I feel about this, but what do I know about this? So sort of veering away from the system one type of thinking into a more evidence-based way of looking at one's information. That's one way of doing that. Another way of gathering information, and again, it's crucial for me, and I developed it because I think we find ourselves in difficult spots when we're patients, but also in other consumer situations as well. So I created a set of questions that I call Ask About What Matters. What it is asking about the risks, the benefits, and the alternatives. Now, that's important. And it's also a way of educating ourselves about our role as a patient, right? I said responsible. Who's responsible? Well, you're responsible because it's your own body, right? So why should you ask these questions and why in this order? You should ask about the risks because the benefits are always tempting. That's great, right? Someone offers you, let's say, a treatment for post-mastectomy, and I'm hanging on to this because it's a great example. It is so vivid. If you only think about hope and it's going to help me and it's going to save me, that's who can blame you? That's fantastic. But let's start with the risks. What are the risks? It could wreak havoc in your body and in your mental well-being. What are the benefits? It could reduce your risk of mortality. An add-on question, by how much? How many people will benefit from that? Oh, by not a lot and only what? You're telling me that 3 out of 100 women will benefit from that? Are you kidding me? As in 97 women will not benefit from that? So now I can choose. It's my right. I can say, I'm going with it, even if it's 1 out of 100. Or I could say, considering the amount of people who will benefit from this and considering the risks, I'm going to say no. And I have not asked for a lot of information, but I've asked for the gist, and it allows me to make an informed decision. So I said risks, benefits, that's self-explanatory, and alternatives. Now, why alternatives? Because when we are in the patient role, we feel somewhat diminished. And I give many examples of this in my book, all of which come from doctors when they are in the patient role, when they are in the patient seat. So some are from the literature from doctors like the late Paul Kalanithi or Eric Topol. And some are from people I sat with who told me things like, when I leave my doctor's office, I forget everything. Or I was in the hospital and the person, maybe a resident, maybe a doctor talking to me, didn't ask me A, B, and C. So the person telling me this is a physician. She's an experienced physician. Why didn't she stand up? Why didn't she say, excuse me, I've been a doctor. I'm practicing for 30 years. You should ask me A, B, and C. She didn't. She did not, because it's diminishing. And if that's what happens to physicians in the patient role, it could happen to all of us. So ask about alternatives. Doctors may not always disclose alternatives, but they don't want to lie. They could withhold information. That's very different from flat out lying. When you ask, is there an alternative? They're not going to say no if there is an alternative. And then if there is an alternative, you could decide. You can then play the risks benefits game again and say, I like this alternative, or I do not like this alternative. And now I can weigh it. In fact, someone told me he'd heard me speak on the radio about this 10 years ago. Like that's very major fandom to remember a radio show from 10 years ago. And it was right before he was about to have prostate cancer surgery. Now, the benefits are you remove the cancer cells from your body, which may, at his age, may have evolved into cancer 20 years later. The risks, he could be risking incontinence and impotence. Those are not insignificant risks. Because of hearing me on the radio, he had the sense to ask about alternatives, and he realized that watchful waiting was an alternative. There are no risks in watchful waiting. In his case, watchful waiting was a great alternative, and that's what he chose, and he didn't have to encounter the risks. So why don't we ask about this? For starters, because we are diminished in the patient role. Sometimes, not all of us, but we might be. And because of our system one thinking. We freak out, we hear cancer, we don't want the cancer in our body. We go, take it out. I'm going to think in very unidimensional ways, and that's legitimate, but that may not benefit me. So those are aspects of it. I want to throw in one more thing, and that's bias. And Beth, you mentioned implicit bias. I want to talk about implicit bias that we encounter. You and I belong to a minority. Did you know that, Beth? We're women. I mean, you could claim that we are 51% of the population, but medicine is geared more toward men than it is toward women. We are likely, when we complain of pain, to be dismissed, to be told, well, it's psychological, it's in your head, or you complain of a pain that's a level of 7. It's probably really a 4 or 5 and you're exaggerating. That's been shown repeatedly in studies. When a white man complains of pain, that's legitimate. He's a white man, clearly a cowboy, clearly has high pain tolerance, and if he complains, it's for real. If it's an African American man, well, they are much more likely to have to wait significantly longer for pain medication than a white man. Likewise, if they're Hispanic. This is very painful. It's painful for me to say that. We're in 2021, bias, implicit or explicit, should have been gone a long time ago. It's hard to combat that, but there are 2 things you can do. One is to understand that this is not just happening to you. It's not because of you. It's a thing. It's a phenomenon. It's a major issue. It doesn't really help me if I'm in pain and I'm being dismissed, but I understand that something bigger than me is going on. Another way of combating this actively is by asking, could there be an alternative medical explanation? When someone is saying, well, it's probably psychological, could there be an alternative medical explanation? Interesting. You're not contesting, and this is a conflict resolution unit, so you're not contesting the physician's authority. You're not undermining them, but you're throwing the medical authority back at them and asking, could there be something else going on? Is it likely that with my type of injury, I am experiencing pain at a level of 7? Interesting. Maybe it is, in spite of the fact that you're a woman. Maybe you are in this amount of pain. So that's a way of asserting yourself without being conflictual, which I think is something your audience appreciates. So thank you so much for this question.
Thank you. So one of the questions that came in was something about ways in which empowering consumers. But what I'd like to do is expand that a little bit to really talk about empowering or strengthening decision makers, right? Because you're getting lots of information. And even if we look at alternatives, there are many times when very serious decisions that have to be made, whatever they are, people feel pressured to make that decision on their own, because then they have to accept the responsibility of what they're deciding to do. So they may not say this in these words, but sometimes they do. It's like, just tell me what to do. Just tell me what to do. And sometimes people throw it and say, what would you do in my situation? So hearing from both of you, can just give any kind of comment on what are some ways in which we can empower or strengthen any of the populations you're talking about to have the confidence to ask these questions and make better quality decisions. So I'll just go Talya first, and then we'll go to Barry, if that's okay.
Sure. I think most of my messages are about you need help making medical decisions. It's legitimate to ask for help. It is actually the doctor's role to guide us. And in fact, I gave an entire range. When I wrote about choice, I said some people want to make a decision on their own. Some would like to relinquish that responsibility. There's actually a formal model of doing that, of assigning your responsibility to your physician and saying, this is not some paternalistic sort of choice. This is me making a very conscious decision to tell my doctor, please choose this for me, and I'm relinquishing liability. I'm not going to blame you if anything goes wrong. I understand that this is medicine, but I need your help with deciding, and that's incredibly legitimate. It's also legitimate to ask questions. It's not a sign of stupidity. It's not a sign of ignorance. It's a sign of just taking on the active patient role. And it is likewise legitimate to not even know what to ask. There's a wonderful unit at UCSF that does that walks breast cancer patients. Literally, they used to be by the hand, now it's by the Zoom, but with the same intention of just eliciting their questions and making sure these questions are heard in the encounter with the physician. It's not easy. It's important for me to say that it is not easy, but it still is your role to ask questions. I think when we ask the doctor, what would you do? I understand why we ask that. It's incredibly human, right? But it's not necessarily the right question because the doctor is different from me. They have a different physique. They have different habits. Maybe we're speaking about knee surgery and the doctor is a marathon runner and I'm a couch potato. So for the doctor to have knee surgery would be devastating because they wouldn't be able to run for 6 weeks. And for me, that's kind of okay. Maybe the doctor has discipline to have physical therapy and I don't, or vice versa. So asking them, what would you do is really a very humane cop-out, but it's not really the best way for you to figure out what is best for you or for your loved one.
Right, thank you. And Barry?
So let me address your query, Beth, from the perspective of little people, because I think the decision-making is a developmental process. And we don't often think that very young children are responsible enough to make decisions, but we wonder how they grow that responsibility. And I think it starts when they're very, very young by giving limited forced choice. We're at dinner, out at a restaurant. You're 2.5 years old. You're looking at a menu like everyone else is. You can't read it, but you can look at pictures. Would you like the macaroni and cheese from the child's menu, or would you like a chicken rice bowl, whatever it is? Forced choice. Either of those choices is acceptable as parents. And then when the child says, oh yeah, I love the macaroni and cheese here, you reinforce that they're the kind of person at 3 years old or 2.5 years old who can make good choices. And as they develop, they're hearing this constant self-fulfilling prophecy that because at 12 and 13, they're going to be making some really important decisions. Not likely about health independently, but they are about social interaction, academics, all sorts of decisions that will impact their future. For instance, we know that 50% of 15-year-olds are sending naked pictures of themselves to other people. They're sexting. How is that going to impact your future? And how do we make decisions that are the best for us? Well, when we're using the model that says, what information do I need? And what are the choices? How do I brainstorm those choices? I think it's really evident that a collaborative approach, gathering more information, as Talya suggests, asking others for input, getting coaches and caring adults and peers to weigh in on those possibilities helps us, even though the factors that are influencing you the most are most likely connected to your core values. And other people can't define your core values for you, but they can help you with what information do you need to know. We started this by introducing, you're the new kid in town. You're 13 years old, you've been living away. It's really hard to meet people in your new city. But all of a sudden you get invited to a party and it's the cool people's party and you really want to go. You talk to your parents about it. They say, okay, you got to be home at 10:30. And you look at your watch and it's 10:20 and you recognize that you need to leave now, but you're also enjoying the party. You're at the center of some attention. People are asking you about your past experiences. There might even be somebody who's got a little twinkle in their eye at you. What do? What information do you need to know? Maybe you learn something from an older sibling about what happens when you violate curfew. Maybe your friends have had issues around curfew. Maybe it's worth violating curfew to stay in the situation. How are you going to regain trust with your parents the next time? What if you're not allowed to go out for the rest of the year? You can imagine that information gets so sizable that it's really hard to sort through it, which is why we want people particularly at this young age, to be making a systematic, thoughtful, and intentional choice based on weighing those positive and negative consequences.
Thanks. So what both of you were talking about is being able to take in different kinds of information to help you in making those decisions. Some of it may come from other people, some from examples, from your own past experiences, and from what somebody wrote into one of the questions here about big data. So if we look around us, there's tons of information. We have information overload. Anywhere we go on the internet, anywhere, we're just bombarded with information. If we're talking about tons of information, and a lot of it, of course, contradictory, because if all the information said the same thing, it would be easy. Just say, okay, I'll just follow the information. But of course, it's contradictory, and then you really have to weigh it, right? And then you're thinking, okay, I also have my biases, and I don't know. So then how can you, and one of the questions here is, how do you shift people from being able to take in some of this data from all around them to shift from system 1 to system 2, from the very quick emotional responsiveness to a slower, more thorough, rational way of making a decision? So any comments there? So maybe Barry and then Talya.
In our model, after we've identified some brainstorm possibilities to address the problem, we're asking people to weigh the positive and negative consequences. And I think Talya did a really good job of teasing out for us, for instance, in the example around breast cancer. What's the positive consequence of doing hormone therapy? What's the positive consequence of surgery? What's the positive consequence of radiation? What's the negative and if you do the thoughtful, careful analysis of the positive and negative consequences using the best information you can, and I agree, Beth, it's pretty complicated, and you do that for each of those choices. Sometimes there's only a couple of choices. Who do I live with, my mother or my father? Doesn't leave us with many other choices. But what's the positive consequences of living with mom? What's the positive consequences of living with dad? What are the negative consequences of living with? I think that lends itself to a more ordered and thoughtful weighing of the values and the choice that we make.
I want to talk about digital health, and I'll tell you why. So I've been doing a lot of work in this space, and I think it's fascinating. It's booming. I'm actually, as I mentioned, I'm at the health conference in Boston, and everything is very digital and very techy and very advanced. But people are still people. So I think the best way is to shift people from system 1 to system 2-ish. Why ish? Because when you use, for example, a Fitbit, and when you use any digital device, the best ones are ones that let you stay in system 1, that do not require an inordinate amount of thinking on your side, that do not require that you process all the information, but rather that streamline it for you. So I think that really is key. And the first consulting work I did in digital health was more than 10 years ago. I was speaking to the founders of a company, and they had developed a dashboard that took into account various indicators of your health and showed you where you were. And it was complicated. It was the kind of thing that gives you a headache. There were lights and things and color codings. And I looked at it and I said it was clearly developed by an engineer. The CEO lost sleep for a month. The idea was, let's make this simple. Let's make this emotional. I know it's important. Our health is important. And in theory, I shouldn't be here speaking about how to help people make better decisions about their health, because it's their health, right? I called my book, Your Life Depends on It. If your life depends on it, do the work for the love of God and just make great decisions. But it's difficult. So what we did with that company is we shifted. We changed the dashboard. We made it much simpler. We made it much more emotional, and we took into account people's barriers. For example, what if today I'm in the red zone? I'm not doing well with my health. Does that mean I now hate the dashboard and I walk away? Or does that mean I need some encouragement? and I need some feedback. And I need some feedback to tell me, hey, you're doing fine, or stay here. You'll be doing better. We have faith in you. So basically, I think, and it's interesting in this day and age where we're so sophisticated, we're still so human, and we still make mental shortcuts. And the really good systems that work with us are ones that help us make mental shortcuts. Let me remind you of Netflix. When you go on Netflix, it doesn't tell you we have 2,000 shows to choose from. It shows you a strip. It says continue watching. It says recommended for you. They already start the trailer. They make things very, very easy for you. They don't need you to think too much. And to the degree that we integrate that into health, into medicine, into digital health, we are definitely onto something. Should people try harder? Yes. Do they? Sometimes. Can they? Sometimes. So let's be realistic about that. And I love that you brought it up, Beth. So thank you.
Let me just add, Beth, that, when we finish this consultation, and obviously the last decision-making model that they chose was, am I ready to be sexually active, which was the heart of the original consultation. We had several 6th, 7th, and 8th graders come up to us and say, can you publish that in a little pad that I can carry in my pocket with me so that I could pull it out during the day? And I thought, for many of us, this is a natural way of thinking, but for many of us, it's not. And until it becomes a go-to strategy, I think we want to reinforce it systematically.
Great. So now I just have 2 questions that I'm going to put out there together, and please feel free to respond to either or neither or both. And one is, if you had any questions you wanted to ask each other or comments you wanted to ask each other, I didn't give you that opportunity to do that. And the second is, what's next in this trajectory that you're on around decision making? Where would you like it to go? What would you like to do to continue building on your work? So to leave that open to either one of you.
Well, I'll jump in first, Talya. So first, I'll answer the second question. Well, someone in the audience suggested maybe we develop a game for young children on decision making. I think it's a great idea. We've talked about it in the past. The technology is probably with us so that we can do that now. There's an e-version of the book, which moves really quickly when you're making these decisions. You can go back and replay your decisions to see if they bring better outcomes. I like that idea. I think that's a really thoughtful, good idea. Obviously, we want to get it in the hands of kids and parents and systems, including school. My question for Talya, which, because I think your work is fascinating, is I've consistently worked with folks to understand that in order to GET, they must ASK, that they need to be assertive and clear, particularly with the healthcare providers. And yet I think they're oriented to the fact that, their healthcare providers are the experts and they should know what's best and they're going to be caring for them in the best way possible. What are the obstacles that have prevented us from integrating this information into physician training so that physicians are able to organize their time, their interviewing strategies, and their communication and their interpersonal skills to allow people to ask good questions, to gather good information, and to be empowered to make their own good decisions? I think we still fall short. I know we're just beginning to introduce physicians to being able to talk to patients about death and dying. I think that's brand new. But I would love your ideas of how we can better improve training so that, and I know there's managed care, there's the financial aspect of running a practice. All of us are dealing with all of those dynamics. But how do we get physicians to recognize that they have 2 ears and 1 mouth and they could be listening more than they're talking?
So that's a great question. Before I did my PhD in social psychology, I did a master's in organizational psychology. And I thought I'd shelved that information. But when writing the book, I started out by writing takeaways for patients. Then I realized I have got to write takeaways for physicians on how to convey information, how to create trust, etc. But then I realized I was being very naive. because physicians work within the confines of organizations. And the example I gave about breast cancer with the information is a great example because it's above any single physician's pay grade. They can't do this on their own. Someone has to create this information. Someone, like the Detroit healthcare system, has to decide to convey information at the level of a fifth grader, and then obviously make it accessible, even if it's more complicated. So it has to come from a systems level. It has to come in a number of ways. One of them is indeed for medical education. And it's hard because a lot of medical education is about the medical stuff per se, and less about the relationship stuff, and less about engaging patients. So what I tried to do, and I really encourage everyone to read the book, and I think it's important. It's important because I hope it becomes a game changer. Because what I did is I incorporated the dollar signs. I don't think we should talk about do this because it's the right thing to do or because patients will feel better about it. I do think it's important and more convincing, perhaps, to talk about if you explain to your patients the consequences of their behavior or the consequences of taking medication, they are more likely to take it. They will have better health outcomes. They will have higher satisfaction ratings. They will have lower readmission rates. Your healthcare system will make more money. Oh, now that becomes very, very interesting. That becomes important. So that's the type of information I incorporated in order to talk to physicians as well as to healthcare executives and management to say relationships matter, trust matters, comprehension matters, and here is what you can do in order to improve that. I think, and we're in a conflict unit, right? So I think when you sit across from a physician, it's very easy to feel conflicted or to say, why aren't they explaining? Why aren't they giving me more time, etc.? The truth is they're under a lot of constraints. So that is something to keep in mind. But when we remove these constraints, then doctors benefit. There's a lot less burnout because they feel respected and they feel connected to their patients, and patients are less angry. And really everybody wins. The healthcare system wins as well. I think it's a wonderful example of conflict management. I also wanted to answer Ted Perlmutter asked a question: how is the best way to resist pressure, peer or medical, to make a decision that you are uncomfortable with? Your life depends on it, right? It's your life. It's your life. It's your body. And it's your right to say, I don't feel comfortable with what's being offered to me, or let me just think about that a little bit longer, or I need some more information, because it really is on you, right? You are the one bearing all the consequences. I also want to answer to Kathy Orchin. Yes, I have studied from Annette O'Connor at Dartmouth at a summer institute on medical decision making. And interestingly, she has a scale for decisional conflict. And what she said was, with the best means of shared decision making, you can reduce decisional conflict by perhaps 10%. So some decisional conflict will always be there. And maybe that's okay because the consequences around our health are just so significant. So thank you.
I was going to add that we have two programs at Columbia University that are also working towards changing the types of conversations that happen between patients and healthcare providers. And one is the bioethics program, and dealing with all sorts of ethical issues that are really critical in our world. And the other is narrative medicine, and considering what happens in the stories and the narratives that people bring with them into their healthcare situations there as well. So you both touched upon a lot of interesting information, and people are asking great questions. And then I think there's another question here talking about how can you just, and we only have like a minute or two left, how can you filter through when you hear so many people speaking about their opinions on different kinds of treatments and different kinds of medicines and so on? And they don't always necessarily, I'll just add this, that they don't always necessarily express it as an opinion. They express it as this is the fact of what it is. But what's some advice you might have for people about how to filter out those kinds of very strong testimonies? And then we'll have to bring it to a close when we both comment. So Barry?
I'm going to pass this one to Talya. The question is mostly around medical information. Thanks, Talya.
Talia?
Sure. So two things. One is to look at who's this person? What are they saying? With what authority? Why are they saying this? Are they looking to make a political gain? Are they selling me something? Or are they really out there to help me? And what is the validity of what they're saying? Maybe they were miraculously saved by something. Does this apply to me? Do we have the same medical condition, etc.? And another thing that COVID made so blatantly clear is that there is uncertainty. Life is full of uncertainty. Medicine is full of uncertainty. When someone guarantees something with 1,000% assurance, that's when I would get suspicious. So it's tempting. It is just so wonderfully tempting to have someone say, this is the right thing. For sure, it's going to work. It works for everybody. I guarantee, I promise. Is this for real? That's a good place to say, I don't know. I'm not so sure about this.
Great. Thank you so much. So in closing, any last words? So Talia and then Barry.
I really want to thank you again for this opportunity. I couldn't talk about this enough, and I have been talking about this a lot because the book just launched and I've been doing every kind of podcast and interview on the face of the earth. And I think I'm super passionate about this because I think we all deserve to be good stewards of our own health, and we all deserve to learn how to get there, and we all deserve all the help we can get, and truly, truly everyone wins. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Talia. You can definitely feel your energy and passion about the topic. And Barry?
Thanks so much for this opportunity to talk about decision-making and for your interest in decision-making. I think it's a fascinating topic. It captures my interest as well. Take care of yourself so we can take care of them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barry, for those words. And yes, so this is the Negotiation and Conflict Resolution Program sponsoring this talk, and decision-making, as you know, is part of everything in our everyday lives and in any kind of scale of decision-making, because the decisions you make will either lead to conflict or better choices out of conflict situations in conflict resolution, dealing with the personal and social pressures that we're feeling around us. So thank you so much for participating. And in the next day or two, the link will be available on our website. And for those of you who did register and participate, we will be sending a thank you follow-up with more information. Once again, thank you so much. Bye, everybody.
Thanks again.